Monitoring of loans to proactively determine and manage default risk can be viewed both at the micro level and at the macro level. Do remember, credit risk or default risk persists as long as the loan remains in the balance sheets of the lending institutions. Micro-level monitoring of credit risk is normally achieved through early warning systems, as they are popularly known. These include the following. 1. Perceptible delays by the borrower in meeting his repayment obligations on the loan. 2. The financial projections vis-a-vis the actual financial performance of the borrowing firm or the project that has been funded by the loan. If the actual performance is much lower than the financial projection, then there is a potential case for default. 3. Credit turnover and debit turnover in the bank account of the borrower. Credit turnover denotes the number and value of credits in the bank account of the borrower, primarily through realization of receivables, and debit turnover, which denotes the number and value of debits in the bank account of the borrower, primarily due to payment to suppliers or accounts payables, as we call them. Any perceptible reduction in the credit turnover and debit turnover is an early sign of delays in the cash conversion cycle and consequent stress on the working capital loan of the borrower. At the macro level, mitigating credit risk is achieved through provisions in the balance sheet of the lending institution. Provisions are computed based on the statistical likelihood of default. Such potential losses from default are charged to the current year's profit and loss statement or income statement, as it is known in some countries, of the lending institution. Let's look at a spreadsheet example to understand this in detail. This is a lending institution whose balance sheet for the preceding 3 years and the current year, which is not yet closed and we expect to close it in a few months from now, is shown here. And the profit and loss statement 2017, it is a projected figure, is also shown here. What is of relevance to us is the size of the loan book and how provisions are calculated on that loan book. So this side of the spreadsheet shows you the provision calculation. Our starting point is 36,900, which is the same as the figure that's appearing on the balance sheet. Now, this is split out as standard assets 34,600, substandard assets 1,800, doubtful assets 300, and loss assets 200. What do these phrases stand for? Standard assets is where all repayments by the borrowers are happening on time. Substandard assets is there's been a default on the repayment of the principal or the interest in the last 3 months. Doubtful assets means the borrower is defaulting on his repayment for the last 6 months, and loss assets means he's defaulting for the last 1 year. In the provision calculations, if it is declared a loss asset, 100% of the value of the loan has to be provided for. If it's a doubtful asset, 50% has to be provided for. If it's a substandard asset, 10% has to be provided for. And if it's a standard asset, no provision need be made. Please note, these percentages could vary from country to country and is normally mandated by the central bank of that country or the banking regulator. How is provision calculated? If you look at the gross NPL, it is 1,800 plus 300 plus 200. That is how you get this figure of 2,300. How is the provision computed? It is 10% of this 1800, 50% of this 300, and 100% of this 200. That works out to 530. Now this is the provision that must be made. What we have in the balance sheet, as of last year, the provision for non-performing loans was 300. The current year's computation tells us that this has to go up to 530. The difference between these two is 230. Hence, the 230 is what should be subtracted from the operating profits of the current year, and that gets included as a provision. Now what I'm going to do is to show you how a deterioration in the quality of the loan book could actually aggravate this problem. Let us say the numbers stack up very differently. For example, the standard assets is only 34,000. The substandard assets is 1,000, and the doubtful assets have gone up to 900, and the loss assets have gone up to 1,000. Now if you do the same calculation, you can see that the gross non-performing loans has gone up to 2,900. So because of this deterioration in the quality of the loans, the provision required is 1,550 as against 530 that we saw in the earlier case. What this does is 1,550 minus 300, a provision of 1,250 is required in the current year's profits, and if you subtract 1,250 from the current year's profits, the PAT drops significantly to 35 only. Hope the spreadsheet example clarified how lenders proactively manage and provide for potential loss due to credit risk. In the event the actual losses to be written off exceeds the provisions in the balance sheet of the lending institution, the additional write-off would be effected from its retained earnings. This results in an erosion in the net worth of the lending institution with a knock-on impact on its share price and market capitalization. Do bear in mind, retained earnings is replenished in years when the loan losses are low and consumed in years when the loan losses are high. In fact, in most countries, the regulatory system prevents lending institutions from distributing profits and dividends to equity stockholders during years when the loan losses are very high. Another macro level stabilization measure against credit risk and potential loan losses is the capital adequacy ratio, CAR for short, also referred to as capital to risk assets ratio or CRAR. This ratio came into force over 2 decades ago based on the recommendations of the Basel Committee set up by the Bank of International Settlements or BIS, and has been uniformly implemented across countries as a robust measure to manage risk, particularly credit risk. The Basel Committee recommendations and their role in mitigating risks will be discussed in great detail in a session later in this course. In the next session, we will look at credit risk models and how they can be deployed to predict potential defaults by borrowers.